Hi there, friends. Welcome to episode 66 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Thank you so much to everybody who sent me such a kind email 2 weeks ago when I was down and out with a cold. It was really lovely to be able to share my quilting with you in lieu of a video, but also really lovely to hear from so many of you who are multi-craftual who shared about the other things that they make. Many of you who are sewists or quilters. So I thought it might be fun, because community is kind of the whole reason for this podcast, is for you to share your other crafting skills or making skills. You know, are you a sewist of garments? Are you a quilter? Do you also crochet? Do you paint? Just drop a comment in the notes below. How do I say that? Drop a comment below. There we go. Telling me what you do, because I think it's inspiring to see what things we do outside of knitting. I think knitting can, for good reason, become a really big part of our identity, but I think we do a lot of other things. So if you feel like it, I would love for you to leave a comment below, maybe with a link to your social media name, so we can just check each other out. That sounds creepy, but it's not meant to. Okay, anyway, so today I thought I would close the loop, as it were, on Yarnovers. And yes, I know it's a pun, but I kind of love puns. So there we go. So back in episodes 54 and 55 of this podcast, I talked about Yarnovers. Most specifically in episode 54, I talked about how Yarnovers are not necessarily created equal when it comes to the size of loop created when you transition from knit stitches to purl stitches, and vice versa from purl stitches into knit stitches. The amount of travel that the working yarn has to do is quite different between the two fabrics. So over the last few months, I've been playing with it and figuring out what works best. And I finally have a demonstration on what I like to do to fix the size of gaps between my stitches when I'm working in stockinette stitch fabric. More specifically, when I'm transitioning between stockinette and reverse stockinette stitch fabric. So in this sample here, this is going to be very similar from my episode 54 sample. I was playing with the Yarnovers that transition from purl into knit fabric, or in this case, reverse stockinette stitch into stockinette, and from stockinette into reverse stockinette. Because the yarn has to travel so much further around the needle to go from knit fabric into purl fabric versus purl fabric into knit fabric, our Yarnover sizes are pretty distinctly different. So this is a case at the very bottom here where I worked a standard Yarnover going from knit to purl and a standard Yarnover going from purl to knit. In this case, we can see it's a little bit improved, but now our knit stitch is still a little bit bigger than our purl stitch. In this case, I worked a standard yarn over on the knit stitch, but I worked a yarn over backwards on the purl stitch. What I found is that they didn't make much difference in this case. However, when I worked the yarn over that transitioned from the knit stitch into the purl stitch as a yarn over backwards, versus a standard purl yarn over, when I moved from the purl fabric into the knit fabric, I got a much more equitable size hole between those two stitch fabrics. So let's take a look at what that looks like, so that if you want to try this for yourself, you can make it work. So here I have just another little swatch doing the exact same thing that I had just showed you a moment ago. I've got 4 stockinette stitches, 4 reverse stockinette stitches, and 4 more stockinette stitches. So I'm going to knit to the edge of my knitted fabric so we can take a look at what I do with the yarn when I work the yarn over. I'm just going to work 2 stitches in the knitted fabric, and then I'm going to work a knit 2 together so that the yarn over does not actually create an increase, just a hole. So a typical yarn over would have you move your yarn to the front between the needles, cross in front of the needle, and then you need to come all the way back around to the front again in order to purl that next stitch. This creates a really large hole. So what I want to do instead because my yarn is in the back and we need to move it to the front to purl the next stitch, I'm going to yarn over backwards. So I'm going to come over the top of that right hand needle, bringing that working yarn into the front so I'm ready to purl the next stitch, and I'm just going to purl it. It's a little awkward, I'm not going to lie. It feels rather strange. So you've just created this little extra yarn over across the top of your right hand needle. Now I'm going to purl across the next 4 stitches to my next stockinette section, and I'm just going to work a regular, what I call purl yarn over, meaning it's the yarn over that I create between a purl fabric where my yarn is in front to the back to work a knit stitch. So I'm creating the yarn over simply by moving the yarn in front of the needle, ready to knit the next stitch. And in this case, once again, I'm going to work it as a knit 2 together so I don't actually increase any stitches. So now when I come back on the purl side, I'm going to show you how to process this backwards yarn over that we created when we transitioned from the knit fabric to the purl fabric. So here we are at the purl yarn over. This is the yarn over we created when we transitioned from purl to knits. Because we worked this the traditional way, we're not going to do anything special. We're simply going to purl into that loop, just as we would if it was any other standard yarn over on the wrong side. So now we're back at what I called the knit yarn over. When we were on the right side of the fabric, we were transitioning from knits to purls, and we worked the yarn over backwards, meaning that we pulled the yarn over top of the needle from back to front rather than going underneath it from back to front between the needles. So rather than purling this on the wrong side facing you, we're going to purl through the back loop. The back loop simply meaning the leg of the stitch that is furthest away from you. We're going to insert our needle behind that loop and purl it. This allows that loop to stay open so that it creates a yarn over hole. If we were to purl that the opposite way, for example, how we saw it presented on the needle, where the front leg is the left leg is closest to us, if we were to purl it through that front leg, we would twist that yarn over closed, and that's not what we're trying to do. We are trying to maintain the yarn over hole. We just want to make it a little smaller. So one more time, when we come to that yarn over, whoops, I split my yarn there. When we come to that yarn over, we're going to purl through the back leg, so the leg furthest from us, so we can keep that yarn over hole open, but make it so that it's more equitable in size to the purl yarn over at the other edge of the reverse stockinette stitch section. So there we go. That's how I treat my yarn overs when I'm transitioning between knit and purl and knit fabrics, so they're more equitable in size. If you want full details about the amount of travel that our working yarn does when we're working yarn overs between these two fabrics, I recommend checking out episode 54 of my podcast, where I boldly claim that not all yarn overs are created equal, and I'll make sure it's linked in the description below, just so you can get a full visual of the travel that the yarn does between these two fabrics. In episode 55, where I made my own argument for using yarn overs more for shaping, I talk about how to use yarn overs to increase stitches in a project, both in a garter stitch edge for a shawl, but also in a striped stockinette fabric adjacent to an I-cord, where working lifted increases like a make one right can be a little bit tricky. So since I released episode 55, I began knitting on a shawl that uses just one color per section, and I was using the method I discussed, using a yarn over increase in place of a make one right or a make one left. However, what I discovered is that when you are working a yarn over on each side of the center spine, and then knitting or purling through the back loop to close up that gap so it more closely resembles a make one increase, they both lean the same way if you're creating your yarn over the same way. I wanted to use the yarn over in a way that would most closely mimic a make one right or a make one left, simply meaning it would have a lean to it on each side of the yarn over. So I began playing around and I discovered you can make yarn overs that have leans to them, left or right. And I just want to clarify that by no means do I think I'm the only person with this information. It is very likely that this information was online. I just didn't find it. I determined this by playing with yarn. So now that I know it, I thought I would share it with you so you know it. In case you're like me and you find the make one right and make one left lifted method of increasing just a little fussy or inconvenient or whatever word you want to use there. Here's what I found out. So here's an example of a knit swatch that I created to sort of mimic the center spine of a shawl. This could also be considered like a raglan column where you're increasing one stitch on each side of a center stitch. In this case, I worked decreases along each edge just to keep the stitch or the swatch width the same. But if you were trying to actually increase the width, such as for a shawl or a raglan, obviously this swatch would continue to get larger. But my reason for showing this to you is so you can see how the stitch size can vary between the two fabrics. So below this dinosaur, which is one of my favorite markers, I worked the make one right and make one left increases on each side of this center spine. You can see that we have alternating stitch sizes. So for example, here is a larger stitch and the one above it is quite a bit smaller. Next, actually, let me just zoom in a little bit so we can get a better view of this. Let's see here. Zoom in just a little bit. All right, so there we go. So we've got a larger stitch here, followed by a smaller stitch above, a larger and a smaller. This is very common in make one right fabrics because we're lifting a bar between two existing stitches, which puts tension on the adjacent stitch. So when you've got a really tiny stitch, like this one here, which is between two larger stitches, that's a stitch where we worked an increased lift on each side. It shrinks the available yarn that we have for this stitch, naturally making it smaller. When we go above my dinosaur, this is where I began working the yarn over increases. I worked a right leaning yarn over here and a left leaning yarn over here. They visually look the same in terms of the construction on each side of the center spine, but I find my center spine fabric to be a lot more consistent in size when I work the yarn over increase method. That's because we're creating a yarn over intentionally. We are using fabric from our working yarn to create the new stitch rather than working yarn from the existing row below. Let's take a quick look at how I work these two yarn over methods just a little bit differently so that they have the correct lean to them. If I was to work the yarn over the exact same way on each side of the center spine, they would both lean to the left. But we can make a small adjustment to the right side of our center spine and how we work the yarn over so that we don't get the lean going the wrong way. So when we come to our center spine, that's this stitch right here, instead of working our yarn over by bringing the yarn between the needle and around to the back, we're going to work a backwards yarn over, meaning I'm just going to bring the yarn across the top of the stitch to the front and around the back. So we've created a yarn over just in the reverse direction that we typically would. Now I'm going to knit my center stitch and then work a traditional yarn over on this side. A traditional yarn over will give you a left leaning decrease and a backwards yarn over will give you a right leaning decrease. I'm going to knit to the end of the row and then I'm going to show you how I process that yarn over backwards on the wrong side so that we can close up the stitch without getting a gap. So I've come to a point where I have come to my standard yarn over, meaning this was made the standard way to create a left leaning decrease. We want to close up this yarn over so we don't get a hole. So we're going to purl it through the back loop, meaning rather than purling on this leg closest to us, we're going to twist our needles around a little bit, pick up the far leg so our needles are crossing each other, and we're going to purl that through the back loop. This closes up the gap on the right side. Now I'm going to purl my center stitch, and here we are now. It almost looks like a double stitch. You can see both legs of that, but here is the yarn over that we worked as a backwards yarn over or a yarn over backwards. We also want to close this hole. We don't want to leave this as a yarn over. So rather than purling through the back loop like we just did on the opposite side, we're going to purl through the front. And I find I have to twist this down a little bit. I use my thumb and pull that stitch down so that I can purl into the leg of this stitch, which is the yarn over. So I'm going to pull that down a little bit and then insert my needle purlwise, just as I would if it was a regular purl stitch, and purl through that leg closest to me. I'm going to go to the end of the row and then I'll turn it around and show you what this looks like. So now we've just created another right leaning and left leaning increase that mimics a make one right and a make one left, but instead of having to lift the bar between stitches, we did it all with Yarnovers. So there we are. That is my full argument and closing the loop on using Yarnovers for increases where you don't want to see the hole. It's something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about over the last couple of months since I released episodes 55 and 54. And I hope you'll find it to be something that you can perhaps put into practice in your own knitting. So as we are rolling into May, I am going to be shutting down the podcast for a couple of months. I've done this over the last couple of years because the summer months just don't see us spending as much time knitting and my viewership drops. And it's not so much that I'm disappointed with the numbers of people watching. I just think that there is a time and a season for videos in the knitting world, and my season is in the colder months. So over the next couple of months, I'm going to be putting together a bunch of new topics. One that comes to mind specifically, because I've actually seen multiple requests for it, is adding motifs into knitting patterns. So if you have, say, a basic project and you want to add a motif into it, how do I do that? So we're going to walk through that early in the fall. Also coming this fall, I am going to be hosting a sweater masterclass where I'm going to walk you through every part of a top-down circular yoke style sweater. You'll have the option of 3 different collar styles as well as textural textural stitches or color work. So look for that coming in, information about it coming in August. We will be starting the masterclass in September, and I'm really looking forward to that. If you have been following along on my Learn to Design Then Knit podcast, I will be continuing that throughout the summer to make sure that everybody has their summer top ready to go when the real hot weather finally arrives. Although I've got quite a bit of sun over my shoulder, it is by no means all that warm. It's only about 50 to 55 degrees today. So thank you so much for spending the last several months with me as we've shot this latest season of Knit Talk with a podcast. I appreciate you spending your time with me every couple of weeks when I release a new video, and I look forward to doing so again with you this fall. Have a wonderful summer and just happy knitting.